Hello, my name is Tiffany Harper. Today I will be sharing with you my literacy program. The the poem that I have chosen is called Careful What You Wish For by Jojo Bean, and the prose that I have chosen is The Monkey's Paw by W. W. Jacobs. The theme of both of my literacy program is Be Careful What You Wish For. This theme really reminds me of when something goes wrong in my life or in one of my children's life, that I often think to myself, oh, I wish something bad upon someone. And that's not really what you should do, because sometimes what you wish for can come back to haunt you. Careful What You Wish For by Jojo Bean. Careful what you wish for. You might receive all and more. The more might not be what you want. The more may be what will haunt. So next time you make a wish or a prayer, be careful what you wish for. There. Again, the prose that I chose is called The Monkey's Paw by W. W. Jacobs. Without, the night was cold and wet, but in the small parlor of Valbrilla Villa the blinds were drawn, and the fire burned brightly. Father and son were at chess. The former, who possessed ideas about the game involving radical changes, put his king into such sharp and unnecessary perils that it even provoked comment from the white-haired lady knitting placidly by the fire. "Hark at the wind!" said Mr. White, who had seen a fatal mistake after it was too late, was amiably desirous of preventing his son from seeing it. "I'm listening," said the latter, grimly surveying the board as he stretched out his hands. "Check! I should hardly think that he'd come out tonight," said his father, with his hands poised over the board. "Mate," replied the son. "That was the worst living so far. Out," bawled Mr. White with a sudden and unlook of violence. "Of all the beastly, slushy, out-of-the-way places to live in, this is the worst. Pathways a bog, and the roads a torrent. I don't know what people are thinking about. I suppose because only 2 houses on the road are let, they think it doesn't matter." "Never mind, dear," said his wife soothingly. "Perhaps you'll win the next one." Mr. White looked up sharply, just in time to intercept a knowing glance between mother and son. The words died away on his lips, and he hid a guilty grin in his thin, gray beard. "There he is," said Herbert White, as the gate banged too loudly and heavy footsteps came toward the door. The old man rose with hospitable haste and opened the door. Was heard condoling with the new arrival. The new arrival also condoled with himself, so that Miss White said, "Tut, tut," and coughed gently as her husband entered the room, followed by a tall, burly man, beady of eye and redundant of visage. "Sergeant Major Morris," he said, introducing himself. The sergeant major shook hands, and taking the preferred seat by the fire, watched contentedly while his host got out whiskey, tumblers, and stood a small copper kettle on the fire. At the third glass his eyes got brighter, and he began to talk. The little family circled, regarding with eager interest this visitor from distant parts, as he squared his broad shoulders in the chair and spoke of strange scenes and doughty deeds, of war and plague and strange peoples. 21 years of it," said Mr. White, nodding at his wife and son. "When he went away he was a slip of a young in the warehouse. Now look at him." "He don't look to be taking much harm," says Miss Light politely. "I'd like to go to India myself," said the old man, "just to look around a bit, you know." "Better where you are," said Sergeant Major, shaking his head. He put down the empty glass and sighed softly, shook it again. "I should like to see those old temples and fakirs and jugglers," said the old man. "What was that you started telling me the other day about a monkey's paw or something, Morris?" "Nothing," said the soldier hastily. "Leastways, nothing worth hearing." "Monkey's paw," said Miss White curiously. "Well, it's just a bit of what you might call magic, perhaps," said the major offhandedly. His 3 listeners leaned forward eagerly. The visitor absent-mindedly put his empty glass to his lips, then set it down again. His host filled it for him. "To look at," said the sergeant major, fumbling in his pocket, "it's just an ordinary little paw, dried to a mummy." He took something out of his pocket and proffered it. Miss White drew back with a grimace, but her son, taking it, examined it curiously. "And what is there special about it?" inquired Mr. White, as he took it from his son, and having examined it, placed it upon the table. "It had a spell put on it by an old fakir," said the sergeant major, a very holy man. He wanted to show that fate ruled people's lives, and that those who interfered with it did so to their sorrow. He put a spell on it, so that 3 separate men could each have 3 wishes from it. His manner was so impressive that his hearts were conscious that their light laughter jarred somewhat. "Well, why do you have 3, sir?" said Herbert White cleverly. The soldier regarded him in the way that middle-aged is wont to guard presumptuous teens. "I have," he said quietly, and his blotchy face whitened. "And did you really have the 3 wishes granted?" asked Miss White. "I did," said the sergeant major, and his glass tapped against his strong teeth. "And has anybody ever wished?" inquired the old lady. "The first man had 3 wishes, yes," was the reply. "I do not know what the first 2 were, but the third was for death. That's how I got the paw." His tone was so grave that the hush fell upon the group. "If you've had 3 wishes, it's no good for you now, then, Morris," said the old man at last. "What'd you keep it for?" The soldier shook his head. "Fancy, I suppose," he said slowly. "If you could have another 3 wishes," said the old man, eyeing him keenly, "would you have them?" "I don't know," said the other. "I don't know." He took the paw, and dangled it between his front finger and thumb, suddenly threw it upon the fire. White, with a slight cry, stomped down and snatched it off. "Better let it burn," said the soldier solemnly. "If you don't want it, Morris," the old man said, "give it to me." "I won't," said his friend doggedly. "I threw it in the fire. If you keep it, don't blame me for what happens. Pitch it in the fire again, like a sensible man." And the other shook his head and examined his possession closely. "How do you do it?" he inquired. "Hold it up to your right hand and wish out loud," said Sergeant Major. "But I warn you of the consequences." "Sounds like the Arabian Nights," said Miss White as she rose and began to set the supper. "Don't you think you might wish for 4 pairs of hands for me?" Her husband drew the talisman from his pocket, and then all 3 burst into laughing as the sergeant major, with a look of alarm on his face, caught him by the arm. "If you must wish," he said gruffly, "wish for something sensible." Mr. White dropped it back into his pocket, and placing chairs, motioned his friends to the table. In the business of supper the talisman was partly forgotten, and afterwards the 3 sat listening in an enthralled fashion to a second installation of the soldier's adventures in India. "If the tale about the monkey's paw is not more truthful than those he's been telling us," said Herbert, as the door closed behind their guest, just in time for him to catch the last train, "we shan't make much out of it." "Did you give him anything for it, father?" inquired Miss White, regarding her husband closely. "A trifle," he said, coloring slightly. "He didn't want it, but I made him take it, and he pressed me again to throw it away." "Likely," said Herbert, with pretending horror. "Why, were we going to be rich and famous and happy? Wish to be an emperor, father, to begin with, then you can't be henpecked." He darted round the table, pursuing by the Miss White, armed with an anti-macassar. Mr. White took the paw from his pocket and eyed it. "I don't know what to wish for, and that's a fact," he said slowly. "It seems to me I got all I want." "If you only cleared the house, you'd be quite happy, wouldn't you?" said Herbert, with his hand on his shoulder. "Well, wish for 200 pounds, then. That'll just do it." His father smiling shamefacedly as his own credulity held up the talisman, as his son, with a solemn face, somewhat merry by a wink at his mother, sat down at the piano and struck a few impressive chords. "I wish for 200 pounds," said the old man distinctly. A fine crash from the piano greeted the words, interrupting by a shuddering cry from the old man. His wife and son ran towards him. "It moved!" he cried, as he glanced in disgust on the object lying on the floor. "As it wished, it twisted in my hand like a snake." "Well, I don't see the money," said his son, as he picked it up and placed it on the table, "and I bet I never shall." "It must have been your fancy, father," said his wife, regarding him anxiously. He shook his head. "Never mind, though. There's no harm done. But if it gave me a shock all the same." They sat down by the fire again, while the 2 men finished their pipes. Outside the wind was higher than ever, and the old man started nervously at the sound of a door banging upstairs. A silence unusual and depressing settled upon all 3, which lasted until the old couple rose to retire for the night. "I expect you'll find the cash tied up in a big bag in the middle of your bed," said Herbert, as he bade them good night, and something horrible squatting up on the top of the wardrobe watching you as you pocket your ill-gotten gains. He sat alone in the darkness, gazing at the dying fire and seeing faces in it. The last face was so horrible and so Simian that he gazed at it in amazement. It got so vivid that with a little uneasy laugh he felt on the table for the glass containing a little water to throw over it. His hand grasped the monkey's paw, and with a little shiver he wiped his hand on his coat and went to bed.